October 29, 1990. For Los Angeles, it was just another Monday morning. Traffic building on the freeways, coffee shops opening their doors, people heading to work without a second thought. But in a narrow alley behind Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood, a homeless man had just opened a dumpster, and what he found inside stopped him cold. 2 plastic bags were discovered, and inside them, the remains of a human being, a life cut tragically short. He closed the dumpster, stepped back, and stood there in complete silence for a moment because his brain was refusing to process what his eyes had just seen. Then he ran. Within minutes, police cruisers were filling the alley. One by one, officers approached the dumpster and looked inside. And one by one, even the most experienced among them flinched. Detective Wendy Burnt, a seasoned homicide investigator, arrived on scene and later said she had never been able to shake what she saw that morning. "It was just so heinous," she said. "I felt it was my responsibility to solve this." The rest of the body was never found, and here is the detail that makes everything heavier. Whoever was in those plastic bags, they had been loved. They had been someone's whole world. They had plans for next week. They had a sister waiting for them in Las Vegas. They had a poem sitting unfinished somewhere. His name was William Arnold Newton, and almost everyone who knew him called him Billy. July 26, 1965. Eau Claire, Wisconsin. That is where Billy's story begins. A mid-sized city in the northern part of the state, surrounded by flat land and long winters, the kind of place where stability feels like a given for most people. But Billy Newton never got that version of Eau Claire. His parents were never married. His father, Richard Harriman, was largely absent from the beginning. And from an early age, Billy learned something that no child should have to learn, that the people who are supposed to anchor you can leave without warning. He attended grade school and junior high in Eau Claire. Then his mother moved them to Ladysmith, Wisconsin, then to Oklahoma City, 3 cities before he was 16. Every time something started to feel familiar, they packed up and left it behind. But here is what the geography misses. Between those cities, Billy was quietly becoming someone. He read everything he could get his hands on. He wrote poetry, not casually, but seriously, the way someone writes when words are the only thing that feels honest. Friends who knew him later in life said he never saw himself as a porn actor, never saw himself as a performer. He saw himself as an artist. The adult industry was just how he paid the bills. The poetry was who he actually was. Wisconsin's cold gave way to Oklahoma's heat, and with every mile, Billy didn't just change his address. He left pieces of himself behind in places that never gave him a reason to stay. At 16, he made a decision. He was done moving on someone else's terms. If his father was in Eau Claire, then Eau Claire was where he was going. He packed what he had, traveled back to his hometown, and knocked on Richard Harriman's door. He was 16 years old, alone, and completely certain his father would open that door and let him in. Richard opened it. Then he slammed it shut. The sound of that door echoed for the next 3 years of Billy Newton's life. Because that single moment, a father looking at his 16-year-old son and turning him away, didn't just reject Billy. It fundamentally rewired how Billy understood the world. Not with bitterness, not with collapse, but with a quiet, devastating clarity. No one was coming to save him. Whatever life he was going to have, he was going to have to build it entirely alone. That night, when he stepped off that porch, he wasn't just a boy who'd been rejected. He was someone who had stopped waiting for permission to exist. For the next 3 years, Billy Newton moved through America with almost nothing. No safety net, no plan, no adult in his corner. Just a teenager surviving on instinct and sheer will. Eventually, he landed in Oklahoma City. And for the first time in a long time, the world gave him something back. He met a man named Terry Elliott, his first real romantic relationship. And that steadiness, that simple human steadiness, gave Billy enough ground beneath his feet to start building. He earned his GED. He discovered a genuine talent for beauty and makeup. He threw himself into learning the craft properly, skincare, technique, color, and walked out with his beautician license. He was good, naturally, effortlessly good at it. But Oklahoma City had a ceiling for someone like Billy. He was gay in an era when being gay in Middle America meant living carefully, quietly, partially hidden. He was an artist in a city that didn't have much space for what he was making. And somewhere in the back of his mind, one city kept surfacing: Los Angeles. In 1984, Billy Newton arrived in Los Angeles, 19 years old, no connections, very little money, and no guarantee that any of it was going to work. But West Hollywood in the mid-1980s was unlike anything Billy had ever experienced. For gay men especially, it was the closest thing to a world built specifically for them, visible, loud, unapologetically alive. After years of moving through places that never quite fit, Billy Newton had finally found somewhere that felt like it was made for people like him. He found work doing makeup and choreography for a music video production company. He got hired, he built a routine, he earned his GED from the LA Unified School District in 1989, years after most people his age, but he got there. From a teenager standing on a doorstep that wouldn't open, to a young man carving out a real life in one of the most competitive cities on earth. That is who was in that dumpster on October 29, 1990. Not a headline, not a statistic. A poet who had survived things that would have destroyed most people. A 25-year-old who had built his entire life from scratch, with nothing, starting at 16. And somewhere in the city that had finally given him a home, something was already moving toward him. Something that had been watching him for longer than he knew. By 1987, Billy Newton had built something most people only dream about. His name was on a production company. His hands were behind the camera, behind the makeup chair, behind the entire creative vision of everything they put out. He was 22 years old, and he had turned nothing into something through sheer force of will. But the same city that gave him everything was quietly stalking him. It started at the Hollywood Spa, 1650 Ivar Avenue. One of the largest gay bathhouses in Los Angeles, 100 rooms, 100,000 visitors a year. A place where West Hollywood's underground world came to breathe. Late nights, dimly lit hallways, a community that existed almost entirely outside the view of the rest of the city. That is where he met Mark Robbins. Mark went by David Ray in the industry. Adult film producer, experienced, connected, and the moment he met Billy, he saw something, not just looks, a natural instinct for atmosphere, for making a room feel like something it was not. Billy could walk into an ordinary apartment and redecorate it so completely that on camera it looked like an entirely different world. Mark recognized that immediately. What started as professional became personal. London Ray Productions was born in 1987. And with it, two versions of Billy Newton, Bill E. London behind the camera, Billy London in front of it. Producer, makeup artist, set designer, on-screen talent, all at once. But the credits never showed the truth. Billy never thought of himself as a porn actor, not once. He thought of himself as an artist, doing what he had to do to survive. The work paid the bills. The poetry was the real thing. He carried both versions of himself everywhere he went, and very few people ever got to see which one was real. Then the city started changing around him. By the late 1980s, West Hollywood was living inside a quiet terror. The AIDS crisis had been building for years, and by 1990 it had hollowed out entire sections of the community Billy called home. Rachel Mason, who would later spend 6 years investigating his murder, described the moment she saw a gay newspaper from that exact era, page after page of young men's faces. Obituaries, row after row of obituaries. AIDS, 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 murder, she said. I was so disgusted. You can't have a murder in this sea of people already dying. Billy moved through this world every single day. He went to the clubs, and he danced, and he laughed, and he also quietly counted who wasn't there anymore. Fear had settled into everything, into conversations, into decisions, into the way people looked at each other across a room. The community was defiant, loudly, beautifully defiant. But underneath that defiance was a grief that never fully got to rest. In 1988, Los Angeles County ordered all bathhouses closed, including the Hollywood Spa, the place where Billy had built his first real foothold in this city, gone overnight, and with it, a significant piece of his financial stability. The pressure started mounting, quietly at first, then less quietly. By the summer of 1990, the life Billy had built was showing its cracks. He and Mark were falling apart. The relationship that had anchored him in Los Angeles for years was unraveling, and without it, so was everything else. Billy was couch surfing, staying with friends in West Hollywood, moving between spaces, not quite homeless, but nowhere near stable. For someone who had spent his entire adolescence desperately searching for a fixed point to stand on, this felt like a free fall back into the version of himself he thought he had escaped. So he made a plan. Las Vegas. His mother was settling there. His sister Michelle was already living there, waiting for him. Billy was exhausted by Los Angeles, by the weight of it, by what staying was costing him. Michelle would later say he just needed a mental health break. That the city had worn him down completely. He was counting the days to leave. Before he left, he completed one final film, In the Grip of Passion. Read that title again, slowly, because Billy Newton had no idea those 4 words would become the most heartbreaking sentence in his entire story. He finished that film, and then he went out one last time, October 28, 1990, Rage nightclub, Santa Monica Boulevard. Billy's kind of place, loud, alive, packed with people who understood exactly what it meant to build a life in a world that had not originally made room for them. He found his spot inside. He drank. He let the music take over, the way you do when you are days away from leaving a city and you want one last night of just feeling free. By the time he moved toward the exit, he was visibly intoxicated. A man named Ron Wheeler was at Rage that same night. He saw Billy leave, and he noticed something that would not fully register until a year later when a photograph appeared in the news and something cold moved through his stomach. Billy did not leave alone. There was a man with him. Someone in that club that night knew exactly who Billy was. Not just his face, not just his name. They had walked the same streets, breathed the same air, worked in the same world, and that specific personal knowledge, the kind that only comes from proximity, would cost Billy Newton everything. Billy left Rage nightclub in the early hours of October 29, 1990. He was intoxicated. He was days away from Las Vegas. He was, by every account, just a young man at the end of a night out, shoulders loose, guard down, moving through a city he had lived in for 6 years and thought he understood. He did not go home alone. Ron Wheeler was at Rage that same night. He saw Billy leave. He saw who Billy left with, and he did not think much of it in the moment. Just 2 people walking out of a club together, nothing unusual about that. But a year later, Ron Wheeler would be sitting somewhere, and a photograph would appear on the news, and his blood would run cold. The man he had seen walking out with Billy that night, the man with the quiet eyes and the unremarkable face, looked exactly like Jeffrey Dahmer. Hold that thought, because we will come back to it. The next morning, a homeless man working his way through the alleys behind Santa Monica Boulevard opened a dumpster and found 2 plastic bags. Inside those bags was a young man of only 25 whose life had been violently taken. We covered what that scene looked like in the opening of this story. What we have not talked about is what happened after the police arrived. Detective Wendy Burnt was one of the first officers on scene. She was experienced. She had worked homicides before. He knew how to compartmentalize, how to stay clinical, how to treat a crime scene as a puzzle rather than a horror. But this one got through. It was just so heinous, she said years later. I felt it was my responsibility to solve this. I put everything into this case. The autopsy that followed confirmed 2 things. Billy had methamphetamine in his system at the time of his death, and he had been strangled before the dismemberment. The cause of death was not the dumpster, not the plastic bags. The evidence suggested a struggle that ended in his tragic passing, followed by an attempt to hide the crime. The rest of his body was never found. Not then, not ever. LAPD detectives threw themselves into the investigation in those first months. Tips came in from multiple directions. They followed everyone. They interviewed people from the industry, people from the clubs, people from Billy's personal life. Nothing held. Every lead dissolved. Every tip went cold. The case, as cases do when the evidence simply is not there, quietly moved to the back of the pile. And Billy Newton's murder joined a long list of unsolved homicides in a city that had too many of them, but Detective Burnt never fully let it go. In 2005, 15 years after that Monday morning in the alley, she was appointed supervisor of the LAPD homicide unit in Hollywood, and one of the first things she did was pull Billy's file back out. She told journalist Mickey Ski that she had been assigned to different divisions over the years as the case stalled, but she had never forgotten it, not once. On October 29, 2005, the exact 15th anniversary of the discovery, Fox 11 reporter Tony Valdez met Burnt at the original crime scene. They stood in that alley together and talked about a case that had never been closed, never been solved, never been given the ending it deserved. It generated some attention, some renewed interest, and then nothing again. In December 2006, a journalist named Mickey Ski reported something that cut deeper than any cold case update. Billy's father, Richard Harriman, had reached out. He was still in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, still waiting, still hoping. And he was angry, quietly, devastatingly angry, because he believed the LAPD had put his son's murder on the back burner. That Billy's life had been quietly deemed less urgent, less worthy of the full force of investigation. Richard left an email address where he could be contacted, reaching out through a journalist because he had no other way to make anyone listen. Think about that for a moment. A father in Wisconsin reduced to leaving an email address in a trade publication, hoping someone, anyone, would care enough to reply. The years kept passing. The email address stopped working. The media attention faded completely. And on June 2nd, 2011, the Eau Claire Leader-Telegram ran an obituary for Richard Dick Hollis Harriman. It noted that he had passed away at his residence, surrounded by family and friends. It listed, among those who had predeceased him, a son named William. Richard Harriman died without ever knowing who killed his son. He died with that question unanswered. He died having spent the last 20 years of his life watching a case get filed away, reinvestigated, forgotten, and filed away again. That is not a footnote, that is a verdict. And how much Billy Newton's life was worth to the systems that were supposed to fight for it. By 2020, 30 years had passed. 30 years since that alley. 30 years since Wendy Burnett stood at that dumpster and promised herself she would solve it. 30 years of Billy Newton's murder sitting in a file somewhere, cold and unresolved, while the person who killed him lived their life. The Jeffrey Dahmer tip had gone nowhere. Dahmer himself, before he was beaten to death in prison in 1994, had denied any involvement in Billy's murder. That lead, the one that had felt so promising, so perfectly horrible, had collapsed into nothing, and it seemed like that was how this story was going to end. Unsolved, forgotten, another name on a list that nobody was reading anymore. But in 2020, two podcast hosts were sitting in front of a microphone talking about cold cases they could not stop thinking about. And one of them said a name, Billy London. For 3 decades, Billy's killer had walked free. But that podcast episode, recorded on a whim, driven purely by obsession, had just lit a fuse. And this time, it was not going to go out. Before we go any further, drop in the comments right now, where in the world are you watching this from? And if you want more cases like this one, the biggest support you can give us is a like and a subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making these videos. Links to more mysterious cases are waiting for you in the description. Now let's get back to where we left off. What a retired detective, a stay-at-home dad, and a documentary filmmaker had in common. They all refused to let Billy be forgotten. And that refusal, that quiet, stubborn refusal to accept 30 years of silence as the final answer, is what broke this case open. It started with a microphone. In August 2020, authors Christopher Rice and Eric Shaw Quinn sat down to record an episode of their podcast, The Dinner Party Show. They were not investigators. They were not law enforcement. They were writers who had become obsessed with a cold case that the rest of the world had largely forgotten. Episode 37. They talked about Billy Newton's murder, about the dumpster, the plastic bags, the 30 years of nothing, and at the end, they did something simple. They set up a dedicated email address and asked anyone who knew anything to reach out. They did not expect much. 2 months later, they recorded episode 48, and this time they had something. A man named Ron Wheeler had written in. He had been at Rage nightclub the night Billy was last seen alive, and he had watched Billy walk out of that club with someone. A year after Billy's murder, Wheeler had seen a photograph in the news, and the face staring back at him had stopped him cold. The man he had seen with Billy looked exactly like Jeffrey Dahmer. Rice and Quinn put it out there carefully, honestly. It was a tip, not a confirmation, but it was the most concrete lead the case had seen in 3 decades, and it electrified their audience. Here was the problem. Jeffrey Dahmer, before he was killed in prison in November 1994, had been questioned about Billy Newton's case. He denied it, and when investigators later looked at the full timeline, the geography, the specifics, the Dahmer connection did not hold. Dahmer operated almost entirely in Milwaukee. His method was specific and well documented. Billy's murder did not match his pattern. The most promising lead in 30 years was a dead end. But the podcast had done something that no amount of official reinvestigation had managed to do. It had put Billy's name back into the world, and the right people were listening. One of those people was Rachel Mason. Mason had first encountered Billy Newton's story years earlier while making her documentary Circus of Books, a film about her parents' adult bookstore on Santa Monica Boulevard, which for decades had been at the beating heart of West Hollywood's gay community. While searching for archive material, she had been handed an old issue of The Advocate magazine. Inside was an article from 1990 with a headline that hit her like a wall. Cops have no clues in. Brutal killing of L.A. Porn actor. The article had been written by journalists Chris Bull and Mike Szymanski. It detailed the discovery of Billy's remains, interviewed his friends and his boyfriend, described a young man who had left home at 16 to escape a world that did not have room for him, and had built something real in Los Angeles, only to have it taken in the most brutal way imaginable. Mason could not put it down. She finished Circus of Books, and then she went back to Billy. She started investigating, she started reaching out. And she began building a documentary that she initially hoped would simply humanize the victim, give Billy back his story even if the murder was never solved. She could not have imagined what the investigation would actually uncover. Then Clark Williams entered the picture. Williams was a stay-at-home dad and social worker living in Sherman Oaks, California. He had come across a Facebook post about Billy Newton's unsolved murder while scrolling one evening, and something about it would not let him go. Because Clark Williams had grown up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. He had been born in the same week as Billy in 1965. He had grown up in the same region, understood the same suffocating smallness of that world, and had eventually made his own escape to a larger city. He was, in almost every meaningful way, a parallel version of Billy Newton. The version that made it. Billy became a person to me that I knew and loved, Williams said later. He connected with Rachel Mason, and then he went to work. Williams began doing something meticulous and methodical that no one had thought to do before, or at least not with this level of focus. He started going through adult film credits from the late 1980s. Every name, every alias, every person who had worked in the same world as Billy Newton around the time of the murder, cross-referencing, building a map, and then a name surfaced, Billy Houston. An actor who had appeared in a film called The Devil and Danny Webster, produced in the same orbit as London Ray Productions, operating in the same West Hollywood scene. Williams pulled on that thread, and the name underneath the alias was Daryl Lynn Madden. Williams ran that name. And what came back stopped him cold. Daryl Lynn Madden had pleaded guilty in 2008 to the murder of a gay man in Oklahoma City, a hate crime connected to a white supremacist gang called the Chaos Squad Skinheads, already serving life in prison. But that was not the part that made Williams reach for his phone, because Williams had found something else, a book called American Honor Killings, and buried inside it was an interview with Madden, in which Madden casually, almost offhandedly, confessed to committing another murder. An earlier one, in Los Angeles. No name given, no details, just Los Angeles. A previous killing, Williams called Detective John Lamberti, laid out everything he had found, every connection, every credit, every thread. Lamberti ran the background check. And what he found made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Daryl Lynn Madden's adult film production company had been based on Santa Monica Boulevard, the exact stretch of road where Billy Newton's remains had been found. That was not a coincidence. That was a confession hiding in plain sight. The killer had been in the same industry, working the same streets, possibly in the same rooms, and Billy Newton, who knew everyone in that world, who had worked those sets, who recognized faces, had very likely known exactly who this person was. Which meant the killer had known exactly who Billy was too. And that changed everything about what happened on the night of October 28, 1990. When detectives finally walked into that Oklahoma prison in January 2023, they kept it simple. They told Daryl and Madden they were there to talk about an old case from Los Angeles. Nothing specific, no names, no details, just an old case. They wanted to see what she would do with that. What she did shocked them. Madden leaned forward and said, without being asked, without being prompted, "Oh, you mean the one where somebody's head and feet were found in a dumpster?" The detectives looked at each other. 32 years. 32 years of silence, of dead ends, of a father dying without answers, of a sister carrying grief she could not put down. And the person who had been holding the truth the entire time had just handed it over in a single sentence, unprompted, as if it had been sitting right there behind her teeth, waiting. To understand what happened that night in 1990, you have to understand who Daryl Lynn Madden was at the time, not who Madden is now. Now, Madden is a transgender woman and an Orthodox Jew, serving multiple life sentences in an Oklahoma prison. That is the present. But in 1990, Daryl Lynn Madden was living 3 separate lives simultaneously, and each one was completely hidden from the others. By day, Madden was Billy Houston, a gay adult film actor working the same West Hollywood circuit as Billy Newton. Same industry, same streets, same world. By night, Madden operated as Richie Rich, a member of the Chaos Squad Skinheads, a white supremacist gang that specifically targeted gay men, robbing them, beating them. using them as proof of loyalty to an ideology that would have destroyed Madden if the other members ever learned the truth about what Madden was doing in front of a camera during the day. And in between, there was a third identity, Lynn, a sex worker, 3 lives. None of them knowing the others existed. The psychological weight of that, the constant performance, the constant terror of exposure is difficult to fully comprehend. But here is what matters. Billy Newton knew the gay adult film world inside out. He had produced 8 films. He knew the faces, the aliases, the people behind the names. And Madden knew that Billy could recognize the face of Billy Houston anywhere, which meant Billy Newton was not just a target, he was a threat. The night of October 28, 1990, Madden spotted Billy leaving Rage nightclub. Intoxicated, alone, moving slowly through the West Hollywood night, Madden approached him, told him directly, "You are coming with us. This is a robbery. Stay quiet and you will be fine." Billy went. Because what else do you do when someone tells you that? What followed happened in an apartment. Madden later confessed that the strangulation was deliberate and personal. Not a moment of rage, not an accident that went too far, a decision. And according to Rachel Mason, who spent years corresponding with Madden and eventually interviewed her on camera in prison, there was a reason this particular target had to die rather than just be robbed and left. She said, "I recognized Billy at the time," Mason reported. And that's why Darrell Lynn had to be sure to inflict as much violence as possible. Billy could have outed Darrell Lynn to the skinhead members. Billy Newton was not killed because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was killed because he was in the right place, the same industry, the same world, and someone could not afford for him to walk away and remember a face. After Billy was dead, there was a practical problem. The body was in an apartment. Getting it out without anyone noticing was not simple. And Madden's solution was not born from fury or from hatred or from any emotion at all. It was born from cold, calculating logic. The only way to move the body out of the apartment clandestine, according to her, was a process that was, in her words, not an easy task, a cold, calculated decision to hide what she had done. That sentence, read it again, not an easy task, as if this were a logistical inconvenience. As if Billy Newton were a problem to be managed rather than a human being who had poems sitting unfinished somewhere, who had a sister waiting in Las Vegas, who had a father who would spend the rest of his life asking why. The accomplices who helped carry the bags to that dumpster on Santa Monica Boulevard, their names remain unknown. When detectives pressed Madden for them, they got one answer, delivered with complete calm: "I may be a murderer, but I am not a snitch." Rachel Mason sat across from Madden in a maximum security unit, double shackles, a guard standing inches away, and what struck Mason most, what disturbed her more than anything else about that room, was how charming Madden was. How easy it would have been to sit across from this person in another context and have no idea. Detective Lamberti said the same thing afterward. Funny, warm, someone you could imagine having a conversation with over a beer. That, Mason said, makes it even more disturbing. The Los Angeles County District Attorney declined to file charges. No physical evidence, no corroborating witnesses. A confession alone, after 32 years, was not enough to take to a jury. Prosecutors were honest about it. They could not prove this beyond a reasonable doubt in a courtroom. But the LAPD officially closed the case, with the full approval of Billy's family, who finally, after everything, had a name. Billy Newton left a poem behind. It was called "A Piece of Me." His friends described it as haunting and prophetic, the kind of writing that takes on new meaning when you know how the story ends. The documentary Rachel Mason made about his life and death opens with it and closes with it. Because the whole point of everything, the podcast, the OSINT, the years of investigation, the prison interview, was never really about the killer. It was always about giving Billy back his own story. He left Eau Claire at 16 with nothing. He built a life from scratch in one of the hardest cities in the world. He wrote poetry in an industry that did not care about poetry. He carried beauty in him, genuine, real beauty, right up until the moment someone decided his life was worth less than a secret. Billy Newton deserved so much more than a dumpster on Santa Monica Boulevard. The person who took everything from him will spend the rest of their life behind bars. That is the only justice this story gets. It is incomplete, and it is late, and it will never fully be enough. But Billy was a poet. He was an artist. He was someone's son, someone's brother. He was Mark's partner, Michelle's reason to wait, Richard's unanswered prayer. He was all of our brother. And now, finally, he is not forgotten. What do you think drove someone to live three completely separate lives? And how long can a person carry that kind of secret before it destroys them? Billy's murder went unsolved for 32 years, partly because his life was considered less newsworthy than others. Does that still happen today? And who else might be waiting for someone to simply refuse to forget them? If Clark Williams had never seen that Facebook post, if Christopher Rice had never said that name on a podcast, would this case have ever been solved? And how many other Billy Newtons are out there waiting for the right person to just start asking questions?